welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I am Jessica, your host, and my co-host is
Jen. Nice to see you all, or hear, actually I'm not even going to hear you. It's nice for you to hear us.
Yes. And we're really excited. This is a type of episode that we love to do, where we reach out to other podcasters, or professional podcasters rather, as opposed to librarian podcasters who fell into this. Especially podcasters who talk about really cool and interesting things. Jen and I often just randomly talk about theories and like things that we heard as kids that scared us, or things that people are telling us should scare us, or all of that. So when I was discussing with Jen, like, hey, let's reach out to some more professional podcasters, immediately Chelsey Weber-Smith and their podcast, American Hysteria, was like right there front and center. Like, let's see if they're willing to talk with us. And that's where we came from. That's how we got here today. So Chelsey Weber-Smith, welcome, and tell us about American Hysteria.
Well, thank you both for having me. I am a huge fan of the library as an institution, so thank you for your work as part of the great library. So American Hysteria is a podcast that explores moral panics, urban legends, conspiracy theories, and general American fantastical thinking. And I think it's really about looking at a 400-year history of whatever topic we're doing, if possible, and showing the way that thought and theory and kind of our big overarching narratives about certain things have formed throughout history, and kind of comparing things we hear about today to the same things we were freaking out about, concerned about, obsessed with the entire time that white people have been in America, freaking out about various different things that often include folk devils and the idea of scapegoating. And we're trying to sort of dispel those myths, and also try to have a good time and find those lost stories in history that are important nonetheless.
Yeah, for sure. And I really appreciate that about American Hysteria. I was a kid in the 80s, so there was Satanic Panic, and Geraldo and Sally Jesse told me not to play D&D because I could somehow, I don't know, like summon demons, and Chick Tracks, by the way. I have stories about those because you're
bet.
one of, so many. But I think like we are sort of this culture steeped in scapegoating and steeped in these moral panics, and it's amazing to see how they sort of, I don't want to say evolve, but they sort of feed into each other. There's always something that happened before the one that you're hearing about now. And I think now, especially as a parent myself, my kids come home and they start talking to me about things, and I was like, oh man, no. We're doing this again.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
So where did this podcast start for you? How did you begin?
It's a great question. I think ever since I was a kid, I was obsessed with horror movies, and I think horror movies have at the heart of them often some kind of moral panic, conspiracy, urban legend. And so kind of getting into the darkness of that, I became, a true crime obsessed middle schooler. And from there, I also kind of developed alongside my dad, who was a conspiracy theorist. He has reformed pretty well now, but very much Illuminati, 2012 is the end of the world. Just these ideas that would then come to inform my desire to kind of look back at that time, because I was also a conspiracy theorist, fully admitting that during the Bush administration, which was a different time to be a conspiracy theorist. But nonetheless, I really understood the mindset of believing the most salacious possible story, the most sensationalized narrative that came my way. And it's still hard for me. I still have to really fight that impulse, but I kind of wanted to take this obsession I had with things like conspiracy theories and urban legends, and instead of believing them, I wanted to take that energy and not debunk them. I really don't like being considered a debunking podcast. That is not my soul. I call myself a flexible skeptic. But yeah, I wanted to take that energy and explore it, kind of turn it over in a different way so I could still be obsessed with it, but be obsessed with instead of like tracing it to find out who's in charge of some kind of new world order, it was tracing it to figure out, okay, who was the first architect who told this story? Then, as you mentioned, like how did it evolve through each generation, based on kind of what was happening at that time and the lens that we were going to look through based on the culture of the time.
I love that approach. And it really reminds me of something that I did as a grad student. I used to study medieval history, and, I took classes on saints, and then I taught classes on saints to undergrads. And all the time, like, me as an undergrad, and then my undergrads were like, did these things happen? Like, did St. Francis have stigmata? Did so-and-so actually walk on water or heal this person or whatever? And I always tried to redirect them to like, it doesn't really matter if it happened. Like, put that aside for now, but think about rather like, what does it mean that people thought it happened,
Yeah,
And so
absolutely.
you're kind of similarly taking like a historical perspective, in like tracing the idea, like the development of an idea. And so I'm wondering, like, when you are picking a new topic, either for like a mini series or a group of episodes, like, where do you usually find the seed? Like, where is your like sort of point of curiosity or a source or something? Like, how do you kind of begin? What's your wedge?
Maybe it's the library. Well, I think, I'll just, something will hit a tripwire in my head and I'll say, okay, I think there's more to this. I think there's something kind of under the surface of whatever we're talking about. Like an example would be astrology, right? And I was like, okay, we're going to do astrology. Immediately people are like, you can't debunk my favorite fun thing. And I was like, oh, no. Like that's not my vibe. But instead we went and we found all of the presidents who secretly were using astrologers, which was not a conspiracy. So that's just an example. But I think what I usually do, if I can, is find an academic text about that thing. And oftentimes that's a big guidepost for me. When it's not, I feel kind of good because I am doing a lot of original research, but I do rely heavily on those like you, who have done, I read a lot of dissertations that I kind of find in the dusty annals of my computer. And I think that often is a guidepost, because a lot of times they'll take whatever I'm interested in and they will take it through the decades. And that's a lot of times what we try to do, as I mentioned, is take that same story and look at the lens. And that's just definitely like, I owe so much to academic researchers and folks who are writing these kind of seminal texts on whatever I'm reading about. And then from there, I'm also really obsessed with newspapers.com. So a lot of times I'll just throw in a few keywords, and that also helps me with some accuracy or fact checking of other people. And yeah, I think I often go to the library and I'm often embarrassed by the stack of books I check out. We were going to do a cannibalism episode. It hasn't come to fruition yet, but checking out like 3 books about cannibalism from the library. I really thank the Lord for the self-checkout, unless I don't have my library card, which happens quite frequently. And then, then I have to face the library with my books.
And they say, you again.
Yeah.
With the cannibals.
I think they like kindly don't look at my purchase,
Yeah.
Like people are trained not to like look at your books, to just make eye contact with you.
I mean, they're not supposed to. And I have to say, we talk to a lot of writers, especially true crime writers, and they will say, if anybody is, looking at my search history or my
Oh
checkout
my God.
history, I should be flagged. Yeah.
Yes, that would be me as well. I do think about that a lot. But so far so good. No raids in my house yet.
Awesome. Yes. Is the
Exactly.
keyword.
Keyword.
So what are some of your favorite topics that you've worked on? I mean, I can kind of go through the catalog of American Hysteria
Sure.
and tell you what my favorites to listen to are. And a lot of them obviously are rooted in things that I dealt with in my own childhood. But I'm curious about yourself.
I think that when you say that, of course I was like, oh my God, I have no idea. But then the one that popped up for me was the episode just called Urban Legends, because that was very much about the concept of urban legends developing, like who are writing, like Jan Brunvand, the guy who wrote Vanishing Hitchhiker and so many other amazing urban legend books. He's a huge hero of mine. So I kind of got to talk about this, unknown man, and give an homage to him. I also got to talk about the urban legend my mom told me growing up about the Bunny Man. And that was a lot of fun. I interviewed her, let her tell the story, and put it on the podcast, which is something we do very infrequently, but I do like to interview family members or friends when I can. But yeah, I think that really was a lot of fun. And I got to really express my passion, because I think more than moral panics or conspiracy theories, urban legends are my favorite thing. And I think it comes down to also it being lower stakes a lot of the time, and it's just a lot more fun. And our art is the razor blade in the apple, so I think that kind of goes to show that that's the heart of our story. I do also think of the Westboro Baptist Church episode, which is like kind of a surprising thing, but I don't know. I think I like a challenge, and that was very challenging, to figure out how to talk about it in a way that was both respectful of the harm caused, and then also taking a stance of like, okay, we're going to really understand this philosophy beyond like, oh, these are hateful bigots. Absolutely. But okay, let's understand what it means to be a modern Calvinist, right? That's pretty rare, like a hardcore, straight up, predestined hell type of group. And then also what it means to be in a small cult like that, that's based on kind of true belief versus a type of charlatan cult where you're getting taken advantage of for money, for sex, for those types of things. It's a straight up belief cult, kind of like Heaven's Gate, I would say. And yeah, I just thought that was a huge challenge, and I was proud of how it came out. Yeah, it's weird that that's the one that comes to mind, but yeah, my partner and I, who works on the show, Miranda, we just both really went crazy on that one, and we're really like just we get steeped in a world. And we've just done that with our Jack Chick series, which ended up being a 3-part series. And yeah, the one that it was most like was the Westboro Baptist Church series. And for anyone who doesn't know, Chick tracts are little Bible stories about the size of a dollar bill that have comics within them that are explaining in the most sensational, lurid way all the people who are going to hell and why. And they're absolutely campy and ridiculous. And most people have some experience with them, even if they aren't consciously aware of what they are. So, just really I think my favorite episodes are and they're the most stressful, but you get really steeped in a world to the point where you're not even like completely in your own anymore. And yeah, we really are dedicated to going into different people's universes and trying our best to not exonerate, but to understand how people got to certain mindsets, because I think that that's how you break those mindsets as much as possible. So yeah, I guess those are the ones that I have at least come to my mind in this moment.
Yeah, I'm curious about this kind of like line or this balancing act that you're talking about, on the one hand, because like, when I teach like research or analysis or history or whatever, you often encourage your students to like, like suspend judgment so you can like observe a thing, because often like the judgment will then like shut down the
Yes.
understanding process. But the flip side is that like sometimes students come to that and they think like, oh, this means suspending judgment forever, or
Yeah,
like
right,
refusing to
right.
judge anything ever.
Yeah.
And so like, is it a hard line to walk between the non-judgmental sort of perspective that's necessary for like the research angle and the, the urge to like maybe editorialize or share opinions and stuff like that?
Oh, it's very hard. I agonize over it more than anything else on the show is that line between understanding and condemning things that are obviously extremely harmful. And a term that we like to use is empathy is not endorsement. So I think that empathy is a non-consensual experience a lot of the time. I don't set out saying like, I'm going to find out why this person, I'm going to find out what is Jack Chick's pain, like what happened to this poor man that made him this way. I definitely figured out some things that probably made him the way he was. That doesn't exonerate a person because bad things happen to a lot of people, and a lot of people take responsibility to, ensure that they don't pass on cycles of harm. But I think that it just is something that happens to you, and it's not a bad thing. It's never a bad thing to try to understand and feel something human about the person who is a great villain in your story, because everyone has something that happened to them or some predisposition to whatever harm they've caused. And again, it doesn't matter. That doesn't really matter. But what matters is, how did this person get there, and how can we prevent other people from getting there, and how can we break a cycle? And we can't break a cycle without understanding how a cycle was created. But people definitely can get upset about, we had a couple people be upset about the Westboro. We've had people be upset about the Chick Tract series because we offer, again, I don't even know if it's empathy, but we offer some kind of an understanding versus just saying straight up, fuck this person. Can I swear? Okay, yeah. Just completely, throwing out any consideration of the process of their belief system. Again, yeah, it's not an endorsement, but I find it much more interesting. And I think we get to places with information as well about the thing that you kind of need to trace a person's life to get to. And you're just not going to be able to do that, as you mentioned, unless you're going to get shut down. Like, I would have shut me down completely from understanding modern Calvinism, which I really value because it was fascinating to learn about, and to learn about the history of Calvinism. And I wouldn't have done that if I was just like, oh, these are hateful, horrible bigots. Absolutely. And why are they hateful bigots? What happened? What is the thinking behind this? And how can we break out of that idea and try to create something new?
I think that is, especially from a librarian's point of view, it's very admirable and it's very thorough. It is very easy to sort of see things from here and from here. And I like empathy is not endorsement. But there is, I like that you work on the big full picture of things. So another thing I was actually curious about is, so what year did you start American Hysteria?
I think it was at the end of 2018. That feels right to me.
That's about when Turn the Page started.
Oh,
So
great.
hello,
Yeah, great.
2018.
Hello.
Well,
What
I'm curious about is how did the pandemic times sort of change change American Hysteria? I mean, I can tell you how it changed librarianship, how it changed what we did. But with a podcast that deals with, moral panics, when and just, urban legends, and in a time when every minute there was a new one. How did it affect what you did?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, and I haven't actually even thought of it in these terms until you're asking me that. But in the first couple years, we did a lot of very current stuff. And then during the pandemic, it like you're saying, it was just like hitting from all angles. And I think something I've really learned about moral panics is that when you're inside them, as terrible as it is, it's very difficult to combat them. And so I started to learn, both because I think it's more effective and because I want to save my soul from a lot of the onslaught that I would get from people either disagreeing with me or straight up being, absolutely angry. I'm very sensitive, so I have to take care of myself at the same time. But yeah, if you're in a moral panic, it's just hard. Like, I can't say for certain that if I was alive in the 80s that I wouldn't have been like, oh my God, they're Satanists. As a kid, I believed that there were Satanists, and I was like, oh, those people are totally Satanists. I just saw them in there. And then you go in and there's a spray painted pentagram and you're like, oh shit. So it's like, I don't know. I don't think it's really that fair it's always fun to make fun of. We'll definitely make jokes and make fun of it and overblow it and have a good time. But, I don't think you can see clearly what's happening until you're out of it, and trying to tell people how to feel, how to think about it, is not going to work. It's my opinion. But what you can do is arm them with less inflammatory information that then they can hopefully apply themselves to whatever's happening in the moment, and hopefully have a different kind of insight that maybe dampens out that intense fire that's always behind a moral panic. And I think I've struggled with that. It's like, okay, am I not being brave enough? Am I not am I not tackling the things that I should? But yeah, that's kind of where I've come to. It's a mix of self-preservation and the pretty convincing thought in myself that I'm not going to be able to combat something that large in the moment. And yeah, I think that's what happened during the pandemic, and just the desire to continue to help in a way that also, self-preservation. Yeah.
I have this really weird nostalgia for those like early days where everything was kind of insular and you could sort of reach out to, like, you knew where everybody was. And Jen and I played games. Like, we were part of the groups of people who were like, oh, we're going to play games on the internet. This is where we all live now. We all live in Zoom. But man, was it difficult to kind of like combat what was coming at you and think rationally. I mean, I had a massive argument with my husband about whether or not we should be wiping down our groceries, and he won. We didn't do it. I'm lazy. I'm just like, okay, fine.
God, I remember that time. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Like, hopefully this is okay. I think this is okay. But it was very, very difficult. I mean, you're getting these alerts that, this many people are dying per day, and then there's this theory and there's this, and I can imagine that is very difficult. And I like what you said about self-care, because yeah, for sure.
There's a lot of people out there covering these things in a way that I'm like, yeah, that's probably what I would do. But there's not as many people trying to give historical context, especially like it's very important to me that our podcast appeal to a wide demographic, which is generally why I try to redirect attention away from, one of my favorite episodes we did was called Rednecks, and that was very much about the way that we can demonize impoverished white people to say, oh, these are the real racist people over here in bumfuck nowhere, like Trump supporters who, and then, okay, but who has the power in this situation to actually enact these harmful policies that affect also poor white people all over the place. So it's like trying to redirect, okay, absolutely, these things are a problem, but let's again not punch down. Like, let's not blame people who don't actually have very much systemic power, and let's like redirect to politicians and media people who are making a ton of money off of manipulating us into hating each other. And so, I know my podcast isn't going to be able to appeal to many right-wing people, but hopefully folks who maybe wouldn't be able to consume something that was so explicitly political versus historical, where you're allowed to take information that, of course, I am choosing to create a narrative that I feel is what I would like to, see people believe or see people be informed about, but still making sure that it doesn't push out those that, I don't want to always be preaching to the choir, I guess.
And I think something that plays into that is really interesting is the way that sort of, how to phrase this, like conspiracy theories and that kind of stuff are sort of like the flip side of like the urban legends and the other things, because like conspiracy theories and moral panics are often about like systemic things and vague powers without sources, and urban legends are like about people who kind of live on the margins of society, often who are like surviving. And I think when you bring up like the redneck thing, like you did in that episode, it's always really interesting to think about like what the redirect is, like who is being like exonerated via implicating like the rednecks,
Right. Yeah. And I mean, suburban Trump voters, right? I mean, that was like a huge thing, was that he was extremely popular among wealthy folks as well as, non-wealthy people. It just was an easy way to also redirect away from the fact that like plenty of people who vote Democratic also have an issue with racism, classism, especially, and that the classism part gets lost a whole lot in the conversation. And I think that is extremely harmful and extremely important thing to redirect to all the time, because classism affects every person in America. Or I mean, let me rephrase that. Classism affects us in a way that is very easy to then exploit by blaming poor people for racism. It really, I really don't like it. It really bothers me. And especially I had, my grandpa is kind of the star of that episode growing up, extremely poor in North Dakota, dirt floor house, and was the most liberal old man I ever met in my life. And would never have hated Trump to his very last day. He just hated all of that so much. And so I just thought it was an important thing to, as you said, like figure out how to redirect away from scapegoating people, so that, people on the coasts can feel, myself, I'm a coastal elite, right? So we can feel that we have nothing we need to do. We have no work we need to do. And like, we're so good because we don't use, it's hard because there are different forms of racism, right? There's kind of an explicit, obvious form, and there's like a quiet, insidious form. And just because it's quiet and insidious, just because it's quiet, I guess I should say, doesn't mean that it's not affecting things. And often that quietness is what allows laws to go through. It allows us to act like, oh, this doesn't happen in my city. I'm from Seattle. It's like we think we're definitely above other places sometimes in our politics. So yeah, I think that's another part of the show, is like, how do we look at ourselves more than blame other people, unless those people are media people or politicians. And then I am fully okay with blaming them and trying to find some kind of solidarity within the populace of America, because it's all we have. It's all we have. And if we don't work on that, it's like, we may as well give up. That's how I feel.
Yeah, no, I think you make very, very good points. And these are things that I don't think people really think about. There does seem to very much be that whole like A plus B equals C. So therefore, and it's like, no, not really. It's very easy, I think, to like write your own fan fiction about you being the good person. Like you're the one who's like, the noble one. But it's just it's a whole big picture. And I think, when you're looking at things, you mentioned The Vanishing Hitchhiker before and urban legends. You do sort of like, when you look back at these stories and you look back at how certain moral panics grow, you do sort of have to see where the world was during that time, how the power was growing, like something like an urban legend, like for instance, and I know it's come up on like the Twilight Zone a bunch of times, like the call is coming from inside the house. Like, okay, yeah, well, it's such a good one, right? It's so good. So good. My favorite is the dog licking the hand, and oh my God, did I believe
that was my number one, I'd say, that I heard growing up, was the people lick too story, for sure.
I did not sleep for months because of that one. It's horrifying. But, like, you're like, okay, well, when did this whole babysitter thing come? Well, like this affected like upper middle class families who, like, okay, you can go out, you have a car, but now there are these kids who you're supposed to leave in charge of your kids. And, there's telephones. So, that would come out. And it's so funny because back when I was doing children's librarian, I used to read the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Yes, so good. So much lost sleep.
The best there is.
So good. But I used to, sometimes I'd ask them, I'd be like, hey, when do you, like, because they'd get scared, and I try to put it in context for them. And I'd say, well, when do you think this story came about? And they're like, oh, I don't know. Like, well, this was, around the time more people had telephones in their house. Of course, I didn't tell them the version where the hippie babysitter cooked the baby.
Yeah, I was gonna bring that one up.
Ooh, that's a special one. But yeah, I think like you see these things, you see them repeat, and then, then they come up again in a different context, be it like, oh, somebody's texting me and my phone was shut off, and I don't know how they broke into my phone and got it to turn on and start texting me. I mean, it's like, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
But it's, you talked about the cat, talking, there was Tom, but then there was also
Talking Angela.
Talking Angela. Yeah, I remember that. And, it felt so very familiar. And then when you mentioned the British version of it, I was like, aha,
yes.
It's just these cyclical things that, and like for me, like something like that, it's like, it's a very good distraction from what's really going on. It's very easy to talk about Talking Tom and Angela, and how this is part of a ring of pedophile, which always seems to be part of the story, be it like Pizzagate or whatever. And then it's like, but also there's this other stuff that we're not talking about because it's so sensationalized to talk about.
Absolutely, yes. It's like a sleight of hand, I think, always. And I think a great example of that you may have encountered with your work with kids is the Momo Suicide Challenge. And that was parents, authorities, media people started putting out stories about kids getting random text messages with increasing challenges, endangering them, and culminating in like kill yourself. And kids were apparently committing suicide because what ended up being, the monster was this strange chicken woman, is the only way I can put it, like a scary, just very scary. Look it up if you don't know. I highly recommend seeing it, which turned out to just be an art project that someone did. I think maybe it was Japanese, but and it just kind of paired together this scary figure with this story. But then, okay, so the reason that young people are committing suicide at higher rates is nothing that we can control, right? It's not like, oh, if we talk to our kids, oh, if we got our kids help, oh, if we, did X, Y, and Z to prevent the feelings that would lead to something like suicide, then it just makes it easier, and it also exonerates us from responsibility. Not that that's what anyone is consciously thinking. I think that's really key. No one's like, ah ha ha, like we can blame Momo and then I don't have to care about my child. It's not like that. It's more of like a almost like a confirmation bias or something that happens where, we don't have to deal with things that are so complicated and so boring, I think is the best way to put it. Like, it's so much more interesting, and the story is so much more, as you said, like you're the hero of a bigger story. It's like the Illuminati story, right? Like, okay, if there's this group that controls the world, all we have to do is destroy that cabal, and then everything will be fine, versus like, well, what we actually have to do is like a gazillion grassroots small things to get to a world that we would feel good about being inside of in America. So, and then in an Illuminati story, I'm the hero, I'm this amazing warrior for whatever it is, and everyone else is evil, or pedophile ring, which the satanic pedophile is the ultimate evil that could possibly exist if you were to design, a villain that will get everyone's attention. And so, yeah, I think it is this sleight of hand and this self-soothing method where you both lack control, but also something has control. And I think that's a big Illuminati thing as well, is chaos is so scary. Like, the shattered universe of America is very, very scary and very sad and very boring in a way, because it's just a million small injustices that end up creating like so much pain, and you can't really find the villain that you want, and which means you can't be a hero, which means everything feels out of your control, and it's better to have someone controlling the world than nobody at all. And that's that's what it is, I guess.
Something that I think is like a really interesting sort of unifying factor of like all these examples of like everything from like, yeah, Momo to the Illuminati, is that examining a culture through its fears like lets you get super specific about a culture and like what's going on in that time and place, while also tapping into like primal almost instinctual fears. Like, because with Momo, or with like gosh, the other one that we were just talking about, the Satanic Panic, right? Like, those are two very different historical contexts of like, yeah, D&D is very popular and like Satanism is becoming like an imagery type thing in film. And with Momo, it's like, yeah, this scary monster, and the internet, like, so these different contexts, but like the same fear is like some other force is going to like take your children away from you,
Right. And I think when you mention too, like, just technology, I think that that's really, I know that's not your question exactly, but I think that that technology is so terrifying to us because it is completely new. And I often think about going all the way back to the telegraph, that we started having the spiritualist movement around the same time that we got the telegraph. And even the very first example of the spiritualist movement being the idea that we can speak to ghosts, channel ghosts, have seances. All those parlor room seances come from that, where things are floating all around the room, and mediums are conducting these crazy parties, and so the very first story of people channeling something like that were teenage girls around the time of the telegraph, and they were communicating through hearing taps, right? So like, and they learned this, it's all bullshit, but they learned this language that this ghost was tapping out, and it turned out that they were able to create this sound through actually cracking their toes on the ground. Very weird and gross. But after that, it continued with the telephone, because if you think about the telephone, you have a disembodied voice for the first time in your life. I mean, before then, before the telegraph and the telephone, the fastest way you could communicate was like getting someone to horse ride your letter. And that was not an immediate, but like the fact that you're hearing a disembodied voice is so scary. And we just can't really imagine what that's like. But then we get the internet and we have these monsters coming through the internet and getting to us, and the paranormal aspects of the internet. I think paranormal stories always accompany changes in technology. And, that definitely includes how that's going to get your children. And I mean, that's so much of what moral panics are, is just adults not wanting things to change. I'm guilty of that now. I'm in my 30s and sometimes I'm like, I don't know, like that seems like a bad thing. And I try to remember, that was once said about me. And so I think it's all interconnected. These technology stories, paranormal stories, save the children. You could even say D&D is in a way like a new technology, or at least a new type of entertainment. Like there was a huge panic around crossword puzzles, novels, arcade games. All these different forms of entertainment for kids. Which I think Momo is at a good cross section of the paranormal technological panic and the save our children type of moral panic you see too.
I always say, like, so my kids were like raised on D&D, and they went into school. We got them like these junior adventurer guides, and they're in second grade, and they're sitting there reading about like beholders. And like my joke, I think my joke is like, I'm like, man, when the next satanic panic comes around, we are totally screwed. Like that's it. Like my family, like but really, it's what I did find out, and I believe it was in an interview with Cory Doctorow. I did not know that Gary Gygax was Jehovah's Witness.
Oh, I don't actually know who that is. Who is that?
He's one of the creators of D&D.
And he was a Jehovah's Witness, really?
Was a Jehovah, yeah. And and it's interesting because it was kind of pointed out to me like early D&D, and I think just recently they're trying to be a little bit more accountable about this. They're just kind of problematic. There's like evil races and things like, I mean, that's, they're working on doing better. But in general, it's not funny, but it's interesting that basically like make believe for adults, which was created semi by somebody who was Jehovah's Witness, or, it suddenly became the number one enemy that everybody was talking about. It's indoctrinating nobody. It's allowing people to explore their imagination and not be embarrassed about it, and like spend time with friends in another way. Like there's nothing bad about it. I know we're kind of wrapping up, but I do want to ask, because you did mention Cabbage Patch Kids in a recent
Sure.
Were you part of that craze? Because I was, and I could tell you from the other end what that looked like. I have been to Babyland General in New York City.
No. Oh my gosh. I didn't even know that existed until I was researching it. I was a little bit too young for it, but I did have a Cabbage Patch doll. So I definitely had one, but that was from our Toy Riots episode. And that's one where my granny is interviewed talking about trying to get my brother a Tickle Me Elmo, which, I was a Beanie Babies generation, I think. So I think that was the next iteration of the same thing. And so, I'm a preserve that tie tag till you die.
My brother was Beanie Babies and the Power Rangers, and also Tickle Me Elmo. But I was definitely Cabbage Patch Kids. Actually, funny story, because it kind of came up in my mind. We're cleaning out my parents' house. They passed away last year. Mm-hmm. They lived in Georgia for a short time, and they met Xavier Roberts when he was still calling the Cabbage Patch Kids little people. Problematic, yes. Okay. And there are cloth-faced Cabbage Patch Kids in my parents' house that are signed on the butt, because that's what he did. I know it's just it's weird. It's weird.
Can you imagine the panic that would cause today?
100%. 100%. I just understand how it didn't back then. But my brother and I were talking. Somehow we got into a conversation first about like the Reborn dolls. And
Oh,
then
yeah.
then he found like adoption papers, a birth certificate for one of the Cabbage Patch Kids, and freaked out about it, and then realized what it was. And we're like, oh my God, these things are the original reborn dolls. Like, how did
Wow.
nobody look at these and realize just how creepy? And then you have the whole so weird. But people did. I remember like going from store to store because my mother was really into Cabbage Patch Kids, and therefore I must have them, from store to store, and there was nothing on the shelves. You could not find these things. People were cleaned out.
Yeah. And I mean, that was also kind of like the original, what are they called? God, look at me. I'm so out of it. The NFTs, right? So it's kind of like an original bubble market where we were all
Yes.
saving these thinking, this will be my college fund or something, where I'm gonna get rich off of these Beanie Babies. Or I was also a Pokemon cards kid for sure. And those, you just preserve them and they are going to go up in value as if they're some kind of stock for kids. And yeah, I mean, I think Cabbage Patch Kids, there wasn't the same violence that we would get a little bit later with Beanie Babies and Tickle Me Elmo, where people are literally fist fighting. Although I think there were probably some fist fights.
Oh no,
over
there
Cabbage.
was some. I mean, there was definitely some fisticuffs that we would be. It was a real thing. And also with the Power Rangers, that because that was my brother's generation. I mean, that got a little violent too, from what I remember.
Interesting. I didn't know
But
about the Power Rangers one. So there you go. There's
yeah,
always
no,
something
that
else to look into.
100%. Actually, that's an interesting story altogether. But yeah, for sure. And it's just funny to listen to somebody who's like researching the story behind them and be like, oh yeah, I was there. What is it? Like, don't quote me the lore. I was there when it was written.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But but you mentioned that there were toy like riots even like way, way, way before, because that's the one that I remember.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I don't remember. That's the thing, right?
Yeah.
It's like eventually it's gone. But
Yeah.
I'm sure that, I mean, it's a good example of just everything. Something that comes to mind, our very, very first episode, and the episode that kind of launched the whole thing was Stranger Danger. And, I had no idea that I was going to go back and hear about a kid in the 1800s getting kidnapped by some guy with a mustache offering him candy. I mean, that's lore of the 80s. That's like, instead of a van, it was a carriage, and it was a national sensation, and all these people panicked about their own kids getting kidnapped. And so I think that it's a good example of just how these stories, whether they carry on through the generations because it continues to happen, or because we actually just carry this story, and then the story fits into whatever the moment is culturally. I'm not sure, but I think it's a combination of both. But I know, I mean, we had hula hoops, pet rocks, there was a lot of toy riots forever, and there will always be them, I'm sure. I think has there been one recently? You work with kids. Is there anything that people are fist fighting over right now?
I have kids, but I haven't worked with kids in quite a few
Okay.
years. I mean, one thing I will say, like, I mean, my kids, they like toys, but they also are really into like Nintendo. So,
Sure.
like that's a little easier. It's not like when Nintendo came out and you'd have to go and get the discs,
Oh, yeah.
from Toys R Us or wherever. Now they just can download it. But I do think like there's definitely, like, I think people are trying to make things more than they are. I mean, obviously we have like Pops, which I'm guilty. I kind of enjoy some of them depending on the fandom. Sorry, I know you're not supposed to say that, but I do.
Wait, what do you like? What is it?
The Pop Funkos with the weird eyes.
Oh,
like,
you know what? I live in Seattle, and Everett is where so I
Yep.
pass by it all the time, and those giant Funko toys. And yeah, people love them. People love them.
Yeah,
And there's like a scarcity to those because they're a physical object, right? I would
but
imagine.
not really, because I
Yeah.
heard that like they can't move a lot of them. But still, I mean, but yeah, there's like this, my kids, like there's the squishables, which they're like but there's no like You know what? Yes, because Five Below, they come out with special Squishables, and I'll get an alert that they're out of Squishables.
Okay.
So
all
all
right.
my kids like them. We've kind of curbed their stuffy habit, but that might be the closest we have, but I don't think it's got the fervor of.
No. And I bet a lot of it is like scarcity, like creating scarcity, the way that businesses do. And, you know, now they know they've got the Beanie Baby model, they've got the Tickle Me Elmo model, and they know, okay, like we need to make people think that there is a very low stock of this item, and then we can get people hopefully fist fighting, get us on the news, and there you go. Bada bing, bada boom. You've got a toy craze.
Oh, thank you so much. This was so much fun to talk to
I
you.
loved it. I loved it. Thank you so much, both of you, for having me. I really appreciate it. And again, I appreciate the library, and I appreciate that we still have people protecting our libraries and protecting everything the library means. And I hope that we will always have the library.
So do I.
Yeah.
Well, once again, this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. Our guest. Oh wait, no, my co-host. Sometimes I'm on like autopilot, and I'm just like, oh wait, my co-host today was
Jen. Goodbye.
and our guest was the amazing. That's you.
Oh, that's me, Chelsey Weber Smith. Thank you guys
Host
again.
Of American Hysteria, and we are
Hey.
going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.